Yes, but it's very costly to change your mind most of the time, right? So it's much more strategic. When you have children, can you change your mind? No, right? So that is very, very strategic because we cannot reverse the decision we have made. Huh? So I want you to think about that whenever you go out and work, every decision has some degree of reversibility attached to it. And I teach decisions that are irreversible, like having children, but not in the business context, of course. And so we better get them right, right? Because we cannot change our mind anymore, right? So I'm also involved in investments, early stage investments. So companies, maybe when you finish your FTU degree, have it in hand, and then you want to do an app, social media app or something, you have a great idea for students, connecting them or so. And then you need a bit of money because you need to buy servers, you need to make marketing, things like that. Then you come to sort of investors like us, like my company. So RMIT is one thing, and then sort of investment is another thing. Because we would invest in your company, give you money, and in exchange you give us shares. You know, so in exchange we get shares, and shares typically give us some kind of ownership rights. So we own a bit of that company, right? So that's the deal. Yeah? So we invest, and the founder gets money, and we get shares. And oftentimes we then can help the founder to make better decisions, right? So I'm on the board of directors. You know, so that they represent the owners of several companies. So I not only teach strategy, but also I'm involved in kind of helping founders like you, maybe in 5 years or in 2 years, to make better decisions. So I work at the companies of Explorer Capital. So if you have great ideas, come to me, then ask for money and ask for shares. Make a deal, right? Before this, I was for 10 years in Singapore. I was at SMU, Singapore Management University, and I did pretty much the same thing, thinking about strategic decisions. Ultimately, those are decisions that make companies survive. You know, strategy is really about irreversible decisions, but also understanding what is the ingredient that makes the company succeed. And if we understand the ingredients like when you cook a soup, some soups are very tasty, others are not tasty. So what is the difference between tasty soups and not so tasty soups? Is it more salt or too much salt? So understanding why Google is worth probably about 5 or 6 times the value of all companies that are listed in Vietnam combined. So if you buy all companies in the stock market in Vietnam, in Hanoi Stock Exchange and Ho Chi Minh Stock Exchange, if you buy them all, you have to do that 5 times, and then that's the value of Google. So Google is 5 times. That's not a statement about Vietnamese companies, but a statement about Google. So if you understand, what did Google do so well? You know, and Google is more or less your age. You know, so it's 20 years old, 21, 22 years old, right? So in your lifetime, when you were born, Google didn't, you know, when you were born, Google was just being born as well. And in that lifetime, you created 5 times more value than all listed companies in Vietnam combined. So they do something, and if you can learn only 1% of that, we would be very happy. You know, so we think about in strategy about irreversibility. You know, so very heavy decisions that we cannot change our mind later on. And then what is the right decision? So how do we create value? And Google get it right. Yeah, before actually, sort of coming to Vietnam, I worked in finance, helping companies, governments usually to sell the company. So governments own sometimes companies which don't make sense. Can you think of any company in Vietnam where you think, why does the government own that? Electricity, but maybe there's a reason. Yeah, maybe that's an electricity, we want to have control over that, right? So if it's owned by a private guy, like a bad guy, he increases the price. Maybe but Habico is owned by the government. Habico? Huh? Beer? It's owned by the company. Why should the government own a beer company? Right? Yeah, maybe, but maybe the government is in the business of stamping passports, making sure there's public security, building roads and hospitals. That is what the government, but not should do, and what they do very well. But they should not run a beer company, right? So then sometimes the government say, okay, maybe a private owner is better than a public owner. Public is the government, right? So then they come to an investment bank where I worked before and say, who would buy a beer company? Help us. How much do they pay, right? So this is what I did for 10 years, helping government to kind of what you call equitization here in Vietnam. Sort of many countries it's called privatization. We transfer companies from the public sector, from governments to private owners. And private owners, they're like you, they have better skill sets and perhaps competing very hard. Governments, they have different skills, running the military and things like that, running hospitals, building bridges. That's what the government is good at, maybe not so good in competing. So then sometimes they say, all right, I prefer a private owner owns that company, right? And then they came to us and we had to value the company. So find a buyer and so forth. That's what I did for another 10 years. If you don't understand my accent, that's because I'm from Germany, right? So apologies. So I come from Germany originally. So I lived in the US, in Brazil, in France, and Singapore for 10 years, and now 15 years here, right? So I do publish, because as university professors, we have to publish things, do research. Teaching, that's sort of saying that other people have research, but usually creating knowledge, that's called research. Create new knowledge, that's research. And at the same time, we have to teach, that is disseminated, sort of giving on new knowledge, right? So it all belongs together. So I also then do research. One of my fields is about why is it that some firms do well and other firms go bankrupt, right? So strategy, right? Trying to understand why is it that Google is doing so well and Alta Vista went bankrupt. The same industry. Right? So what are the ingredients for success in companies? I oftentimes also kind of contribute to the media here, sort of actually helping a little bit to shape the public discourse on questions that you perhaps are interested in. How do we get more foreign direct investment to Vietnam? How do you get foreign investors invest here, create new employment, maybe transfer some skills from other countries, transfer governance mechanisms and so forth, right? So So that's something I also think about. Um, so I like to kite surf. There's a picture here in kite surfing. You know kite surfing? This kind of stuff I like to do here. Kite surfing. Maybe more in the south because it's more windy there somehow, right? So I go there. Kite surfing. This is in what was called Nintong province. No, it's Kanhua, I think. Phan Rang, huh? Kanhua now, right? Near Nha Trang, south of Nha Trang. Yeah, a bit more south, then it's called Phan Rang. This is the smallest, it's actually, Ninh Thuan was the smallest province in Vietnam. You know, so it's part of it. So, and I like photography. You know, this is for me a photo of like, oh, this is the backbone of Vietnam's economy. So the semi-skilled, smart, and involved worker, right? Without this guy, Vietnam wouldn't have the great future it has, right? So I like the picture because he's thinking very hard how to kind of do this. This is a container. This becomes 2-star hotel room. Maybe you've heard of that. So invested in a company that do hotels with old shipping containers. So you buy these old containers, you make them really, really nice, and then you can play Lego. Lego for big boys. You know, so if the hotel is going well, you add more containers. If it doesn't go well, then you ship them to another place. So we have made about 50 containers like this. But this is about the picture because the guy, that's the backbone of Vietnam's economy, right? So that it's thinking very hard how to make this container better. Right? And I travel around, I have a young daughter, and my wife is from Vietnam too. So yes, I'm lucky. All good? Okay, so I wanted to just share some observations that I have both as a teacher, but also as I said, I'm involved in the board of some company. So companies that do agriculture, hospitality, and so forth. Um, and you are the next generation of Vietnam. So you have a big task. I hope you are aware of that. And it will not be as easy as it was for your parents. It will be more competitive. We have to be smarter, better, faster, right? So I have some observation that I wanted to discuss with you, if you don't mind, because you have a big task, bringing Vietnam from $3,000 or $4,000 per capita for one person, GDP, maybe you've heard about that, right? To 10,000 in the next 10 years. So you are the ones who have to, you know, I think our generation made a lot of mistakes. And so you have to make sure you don't repeat any mistakes in the future. But the first one, so I think about a strategy first, right? So have you taken a strategy course? Yeah? Or does by force in these things? Yeah. Have you done the resource-based view? A BRIM? Okay, great. Because one of the foundation when we compete is really understanding what is your competitive advantage. And how do we know what's your competitive advantage? Is no competitive advantage, what is that? Yeah. Yeah, I like that a lot. So that's about being unique. Yeah, being unique. And in fact, if you remember, VRIM, you know, valuable, rare, inimitable, non-substitutable, right? Yeah, or O, yeah, I know it's more or less the same thing. It really wants us, forces us to detect in our company what is it that others can't do or cannot have. What is so unique about it? Because if your company has something that everybody else can do, then you will not be better than they, you know. So we have to, as in business, we have to constantly think about what is it that is so unique to our company that the others cannot do, right? And I think in Vietnam, this is oftentimes overlooked. Like, you compete because there is maybe a market opportunity, right? And this is also my second point here. So the uniqueness of a firm, so uniqueness could be, so we have to think about what is unique. For example, in Google, maybe it's the algorithm, the search algorithm, right? It's a mathematical formula. If I could copy that, I would do it, and I would have the same good, solid search results like Google, and can bring traffic to my website and monetize the traffic. So meaning, show them advertising, things like that. Even Bing, Microsoft, if you read, they have spent $4 billion. Microsoft has spent $4 billion on Bing. So they try to copy the page rank, that's Google's algorithm to search. Who uses Bing? Anybody? So $4 billion for what, right? So they were unable to kind of copy, if you want, or imitate Google's search algorithm. Right? So much of the value of Google is basically linked to that search algorithm. And nobody can copy it. So when you make decisions later on, or you advise your dad or your uncle or the CEO of the company where you work, always start with, does this kind of leverage our uniqueness? That, that's whatever we do, does this leverage our VRN resources, our capability that is so unique? You don't do things because you want to do them. So you have to think sort of like, can you build it? And I always find we can do assuming you know very well the VRIN kind of framework. We can also translate this uniqueness, the idea that only companies that are unique perform, help the uniqueness helps you to do better than the competition. And that same idea goes to you personally. So think about what is your uniqueness, right? What is it that other people don't have? Because only that in the labor market, in the job market, right? The uniqueness is really what drives your value. Being unique, and now the question is, what is uniqueness? So, and uniqueness is perhaps not having an absolute degree. Sorry to say that, or an RMIT MBA. Because it's easy, imagine, that's a ticket to earning $1 million per year that everybody would do it, right? So where does uniqueness come from? And it comes maybe from your own sort of history, your own passion. For example, we hired someone who works as a telecom analyst. And when he was 12, he built his own radio in the countryside somewhere. And then he actually, because he was so passionate about telecommunications, then he when he was 16, he did an internship at the local ENPT office. After that, he studied telecom engineering. This guy, there's only one in Vietnam because he's like so passionate about telecom. So they're unique. So oftentimes your uniqueness comes from somehow what you actually are passionate about, right? And make you think about this a bit more. Well, what is it that drives you in the morning, right? And because having good grades in FU is good, but it doesn't make you unique. So maybe you're passionate about fashion. So do an internship in fashion. And then you actually, so do an internship, write every paper on fashion. So maybe you're passionate about sports. So then you do an internship in sports, you work in sports, you write every paper on sports or so that you kind of show that you're actually passionate about something and that makes you unique. Right? So at the same time, so I think we can use sometimes business frameworks for ourselves, because for businesses we have asked for many years, why is one business doing better than the other? And then we can take that tool and apply it to ourselves. VRIN, do a VRIN analysis of yourself, right? So what is unique about yourself, right? So basically, what is your competitive advantage? That is something. It's not like how do I get good grades. That is important for sure, but the long-term competitive advantage of you is coming from being unique. And I hope you remember that. And tonight, have a little session, have a beer or a coffee or something, or a tea, and think about what makes you so unique, because that is your competitive advantage. And how can you build this into your career aspiration and so forth? Right? Then I observe oftentimes that in Vietnam, many businesses think they can do everything. You have some success in one area. Maybe you have success in making something with steel. You have success and success and success. And the next thing that I see, they build a hotel. They kind of think, because we are good in skills, we can also be good in hotel. And that's the end of times of these companies, because you have to understand what is it that you do well, right? Companies are like us. I'm a lousy cook, but I'm good in other things. I'm a good in kitesurfing, And sometimes the owners of companies in Vietnam, they're good in one thing, and that they falsely assume that they're good in everything. So if you're a good kite surfer or a good tennis player, doesn't mean you can cook very well. And the same happens, is true for companies. So understand what are your capabilities as a manager. So that's also important. So what is it that you actually can do very well? It goes back to the first point. So what's your competitive advantage? And stick to that, right? But I see what is called unrelated diversification in Vietnam. And that's no good. Unless you kind of understand the other business really well. But the bankruptcy of many firms in Vietnam, larger firms, are linked to the fact that they actually diversify into something they're not good in. So before you jump into you say, oh, there's a nice pool, let's jump in. You have to check if you can swim, right? As a businessman. So know your limitations and know your capabilities is very important. So many are like, oh, there is an opportunity. Some market is growing. Something is growing. You know, real estate. Now everybody goes into real estate because real estate. But what tells you that you will survive against the best in the business? So you should not say, oh, this market is growing, that market is growing, let's do it. No, you start by saying, here's what I do well. In which market can I use these kind of capability? Right? So they sort of, oh, a market is growing, you show someone a graph that goes up, and then you do it. That is a recipe for disaster. You first check your capabilities. What is it that you're good in? And then ideally you go into a market that is growing. But actually, if you're good in a market that is declining, then you will do well. You know, so that's so the market, if the market is growing or not, doesn't sort of matter so much for success. Your capabilities is really what matters. And so those are like two things that I want you to take away. One is understand where competitive advantage comes from. Uniqueness, right? Think about, you know, your uncle's company, your parents' company, or where you work already. What is so unique about this company? If they're not unique, they will never do better than anyone else, right? So that's number one. Think about it. Think about what is so unique about yourself. The second point is the opportunity is not so important as the capability. Right. So if the market is growing, if demand is growing, does not mean you should do it. If you have the capability, it means you should be doing it. Right. So the capability is really what matters. Right. And the third point, it's also, I think, a generational shift between your parents and you. What are the biggest companies in the world? The most valuable companies in the world? NVIDIA. Huh? NVIDIA. So NVIDIA. Huh? Anything else? Can you name any very large company? Google. So the $1 trillion club, right? So they not billion dollars, $1 trillion. Google, NVIDIA, Open AI. They're losing. You know, they're probably the best in losing, right? OpenAI doesn't make money, right? So they you know, the little subscription is nothing for the cost that they incur. But yeah, sometimes it's got the fangs like Facebook, Apple, NVIDIA, Google, Amazon. Those are $1 trillion companies. Facebook, Apple, Google, NVIDIA, Amazon. If you think about those companies, what do they have in common? Other than being American, you know, more innovative. Yeah, they are more innovative. That's right. Do they own factories? They have no factories. Where does the value? Where's the value of this company? And IP, in something called intellectual property. You know, it's the innovation. It's maybe their brand. It's the quality of the products. Apple doesn't even bother to produce anything, right? So, you know, if you look at the back of your Apple phone, it's made in, designed in Cupertino in California, right? And made in China or something, assembled in China, something like that. They give you the, like, we are designers of phones, we are innovators, push the frontiers of technology. Google, what do they have? Algorithms, brands, and things like that. And what I see is that generation, when they're successful, what is the next thing they do? Buy an office building, buy land, make another factory. Why is this perhaps a problem? So that, in other words, many successful Vietnamese companies, the success is being reinvested in not IP, what we call tangible assets. Sort of like, okay, you can see the office building every morning you wake up, it's still there, it's great. What is the problem with, these kind of tangible assets? Well, why are the biggest companies in the world basically based on what we call intangible assets or IP, sort of patents, technology and things like that? Well, how come? Is this a coincidence? Yeah.
I think
yeah, you're right. There's one idea in business that's called scale. So the scalability. Can you scale an office building? Worldwide demand. No, it has a cap, right? There's so many flaws that's it. Can you scale a technology? To what scale? Where's the limit? There's no limit. So once you have that technology, you have limitless scale. So that's one of the problems with tangible assets, like a factory, an office building, and they are very finite, limited, right? So that if you produce more, you have to make a new factory. If you produce more, you have to make a new factory. But scale is something that you can much easier achieve with intellectual property. And your parents' generation, they have gone through difficult times. And I understand that perfectly, right? So they, things were, when they grew up, not very certain in their lives. And not that it is certain for us today, but of course they have the need to see what you own with your eyes. Right, so you buy an office building, you buy land because you can see it every day. You have gold, you can see the gold. But then you say, oh, we have good customer service. We have new technology. You can't really see it. Right? And that's why your parents' generation is a bit, because they have been marked by a very turbulent past. And there's a reluctance in investing in IP. And it is your task to take off the speed limiter, the investing in office building, in land, in factories, limits the speed of the Vietnamese economy because you cannot scale it. It is your task to take off the speed limiter and accelerate Vietnam's growth by investing in what? Knowledge, quality, better processing, something that brands, So if you think about it, what are the big brands in Vietnam, outside of Vietnam? Brands are wonderful to scale. Once you have a brand, you can scale it, limitless, right? So the next gen Vietnam, hopefully, will be based on more IP. It's more daring because we oftentimes can't see it. But that is where value creation really happens. And you have to think bigger and bolder. Alex.
Yeah, I was just curious because you were talking about sort of tangible and intangible value and
Yes.
property assets. I'm curious about Vietnamese young people, cryptocurrency versus, let's say, the Vietnamese dong. What do they see as a more stable asset, or can they visualize cryptocurrency more than, money in the bank? Or
Yeah, maybe it's a question here. So in that way, right? So perhaps your parents don't like Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. And I'm in that generation, so I don't know anything about it. But the question here, so like taking the equivalence of crypto is sort of intangible. You can't sort of look it up. It's not physical, right? Whereas gold and dong is physical. And the question here is, are you more open to kind of cryptocurrencies and things like that, or do you really need to see the gold and the dong, the physical storage of value? Is that
Staying in the nature of crypto,
They don't understand crypto. Like me.
No, it's like it's kind of new, and when everything is new and people are not open, because. But
Yeah.
Bitcoin serves like pretty much like an alternative asset, basically the same function.
Yeah, and I think the question is about trust, right? So because I made a conjecture. The conjecture is I just say something and we don't question it, or a possibility, right? So I said your parents, because of their turbulent past, prefer physical things to at least non-tangible things, right? They prefer factory to better quality, because the factory you can see, the better quality you can't see, and sort of like, do you trust more that you can create value with intangible things? That's sort of the question here. It's not about Bitcoin really so much, right? And maybe that would be a nice master thesis. So like, or a nice thesis if you have to write some things like the generation shift, from this need to see physical assets versus the trust in non-intangible assets. Yeah. Mostly what? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, but yes. So I hope. Thanks, but I think I have 5 more minutes to. We have someone else. But I hope that you have more trust in building businesses that are about intellectual property, that are about building a brand, about better customer service, about technology. And that requires the boldness of investing into something in the future. right? So basically you have to kind of discover technologies and you have to build the brand. It takes a long time. And you can't see that, but it is your generation that has to take, put the gas pedal on Vietnam's economy by investing more in intellectual property. That's where they're going to compete. So that's my point. The last one, I just wanted to share some thoughts on Vietnam's firms and going international. The other day, I was looking up what are the most international Vietnam firms in Vietnam. Which companies are international in Vietnam? Having factories outside of Vietnam, sales offices, people. Hmm? VinFast, how are you doing? Is it? Did you read the latest? I don't think they postponed it, but they stopped it. They now. Okay, but yeah, let's say that's right. In Europe, they stopped already. In the US, the factory is not being built for now. Other than VinFast, huh? Viettel, that's right. Viettel. Viettel is running a couple of telecom networks around the world. Vinamilk. Vinamilk, where do they manufacture outside of Vietnam?
Lào hay sao?
That's exporting, right? So something like that. So, but I think, I think you see the point, right? Vietnam's next phase of internationalization is by going outside, right? So we always think about how do we attract labor to Vietnam, but how can we make sure there are more Vietnamese companies going on overseas? So there is, you study global international business. There's something called the TNI, the Transnationality Index, where you look at sort of like, imagine you have 100 in sales, and then you look at how much of your sales are actually overseas. You have 100 employees, how many of them are overseas, outside of your home country? And how much of your assets, your factory and so forth are actually overseas. And Vietnam has a transnationality index that's almost zero. Some, so there's clear need, and that's why FTU has a very important role, and in that you have an important role for the next step of internationalization. Right now, it's only export, a little, and it's not, but that's a lot clearly, right? So it's Vietnam trades twice the GDP more or less, right? So it's the world champion in trade. I don't have to say that in Foreign Trade University, I think, but so it's absolutely amazing. So there's a lot of things, but where's sort of like the next move? Going overseas, learning overseas, optimizing. So typically you do an FDI because you do some sort of arbitrage, right? So you go outside because there's some things you can't get in Vietnam, and by not going overseas, we assume implicitly everything is here. Technology is here. The suppliers are here, but maybe not. Maybe you actually need something overseas. Why don't you go overseas, right? So, that's not easy to go overseas. Vietnam needs you. Needs you clearly because you speak English well. That's a kind of very basic requirement. You have the mindset, and so helping Vietnamese, even medium-sized companies, to kind of go overseas, perhaps that's where the sales office would be a start. But the next phase of growth is not only exporting, but being more committed to internationalization of the production than it is today, right? So I do like, maybe you've seen Porter's diamond model. You have seen diamond model, Michael Porter. So the idea, it is not easy to go overseas. That's what Michael Porter said in the start, not the 5 forces, that's another model, or not generic strategy, it's another. But then there's the diamond model, where Porter shows that you should actually go overseas once you have fought a lot in your home country. Very fussy customers at home. So if you have fussy customers, so like very sophisticated customers at home, and you actually can sell stuff to them, then you can do that. And this may be one problem for VinFast. Because yes, they have success in Vietnam, but the customers are oftentimes first-time car buyers. Try to sell a car to a German. They know every single screw in that car, have read 100 reviews, and have participated in discussion for a very, very informed customer, right? In Vietnam, it's a bit different. You buy a car because your neighbor has it. It didn't break down in the last 3 months or something like that. So, so there is not yet the precondition to go overseas, right? So I think that you have the mandate to go sort of like help companies to actually go beyond trade. But also the warning is be careful because, you know, look at the diamond model. It basically predicts failure. You will fail when you haven't fought in Vietnam, tough, you know. So because, you know, if you come from Vietnam and you don't fight in Vietnam, why would you survive somewhere else, right? So you must be in a very competitive industry here in Vietnam, and then you can fight overseas. So yes, we have to go with a higher mode of commitment to sort of internationalization, which is setting up factories outside of Vietnam and so forth. There are many reasons why, resilience and so forth. But also a warning signal, if it's too easy in Vietnam, doesn't mean that you will be successful anywhere else, right? And that might be the story of VinFast. In the US, I don't think they're doing too well, you know, because suddenly, you know, there's a highly sophisticated demand structure versus in the home country, Vietnam. The demand, with all respect, I think some of you know cars much better than I will ever know, but the average is a first-time car buyer, so they haven't thought very hard yet, right? So yeah, so those are actually the kind of my little sharing points. And sorry if I talk too much. It's partly my business, but you have a big mandate. You have a big mandate. I want you to keep that in mind. You should be proud of yourself. You continue to be so smart, but also think about, you know, competitive advantage. What is your competitive advantage? What is the firm that you work for? What's their competitive advantage? You should think about what kind of capabilities does our firm have to compete. Don't think too much about market opportunities, right? And then think about IP as the next sort of step of growth in Vietnam. In you as decision makers, future decision makers, you have to invest in quality, in R&D, in brand. And finally, think about, you know, increasing the commitment to foreign markets by actually going there, rather than just exporting. So I wish you good luck. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, bye.
Before you go, one question for you, if you can say something about RMIT, and then if you can take maybe a question or two from the class. So you have been teaching at RMIT in Ho Chi Minh City and also periodically here.
Yeah.
So you're exposed to a lot of these young Vietnamese business leaders. Can you describe a bit if they're interested in graduate education, whether in Vietnam or overseas? What's kind of the difference? Because many of them are graduating soon.
Yeah.
So do you suggest they get some work experience? What is the difference in the education at RMIT or versus, so
Yeah.
you can describe a bit of
Yeah, so that's a good question. So maybe later on you want to do a master's degree or study overseas, master's degree or some other degree. Should you go overseas to stay in Vietnam? I think what is important is to think about what you want to do later after that, right? What for, right? But if you want to come back to Vietnam, you have to understand that actually things are very different. In my strategy books, right? So the typical strategy textbook has an assumption that markets work. Demand meets supply, whatever. They never talk about lobbying, driving journalists. Not that this happens, right? But being friendly with journalists. And so you compete what we call in Vietnam a non-market strategy. Because the fundamental assumption of markets don't work in Vietnam. So we have to, when you go overseas, you kind of typically exposed to one side of the story. But the reality in Vietnam is very different. And that can be surprising for some. Even in business, there's a lot that has to do with law. So trade laws and things like that. And if you just know one side, so it's always a dream to study overseas, but actually it may also not make sense to study overseas. Because you just see one side of the story, and Vietnam it might be very different. The strategy it is, right? So we see a lot of foreign sort of businessmen coming from the US with the MBA making completely wrong decisions. So if you want to go study and then work overseas, by all means go. But I think the local content is very important. Actually, at RMIT and our MBA, we try to combine a bit. So here's international best governance kind of practices, but here's the reality in Vietnam, right? So we try to show what is best and then what's the reality, right? I'm not sure whether that is somehow. It's easy to say go overseas, everything is better, but I don't think so. Right? Education in Vietnam, is very good.
Anything, take a question or two?
Yeah.
Or some of the students? Yes.
You want to push back? Anybody here? Yeah.
Well, thank you for the sharing.
Mm.
And in your sharing, I heard that you advise the business to think about their capabilities first and think about their competitive advantage first before taking the opportunity. But I think maybe some business when they saw the opportunity in the market and they are not ready for that opportunity, but I think somehow maybe they assume that if they take that opportunity first, they can expand or expand their competitive advantage after that. So what do you think about taking advantage and then try to gain more capabilities and then build up your competitive advantage?
Yeah. The funny thing is, when we talk about a great question, right? So we just kind of try it with a little bit, and then maybe we get better when you do it. There is a paradox. Competitive advantage is built on your VRI resources and on your uniqueness. And the definition is no one can get it. So how do you get a competitive advantage if no one can get it? Have you ever thought about that? It's sort of a paradox. It's a paradox because the definition says your competitive advantage is built on something that no one else can get. So how did you get it in the first place? Maybe that's kind of an answer to you, right? And so if I'm not a believer in this sort of try and error method, right? So do you know how many companies go bankrupt? So in all the companies that are founded in 2025, how many of them go bankrupt in the next year? What percentage? 50%. 50%. If you go to a general statistics office, 50% go bankrupt. So of all the companies created in 2025, 50%, half of them go bankrupt. And the other one have taken Mark's course, the other half. But it's sort of this try and error is not a good one. So how do you get a competitive advantage? And I agree, there are two big explanations. One is luck. You're lucky. Just lucky. Maybe you had a great piece of land that no one else and you need it or something like that. How do you get a competitive advantage? The most valuable company in Europe is called Novo Nordisk, and why is it so valuable? Because they have this medicine that you take and suddenly you get slimmer. Have you heard of that? What is it? Ozempic. Ozempic. Maybe you've heard of that. But actually they were lucky because they were trying to find a diabetes drug. And then they did a trial, and then they found out all these guys were slimmer and feeling well and stuff like that. In fact, and now it's the most sold drug in the world or something like that. So they were lucky. And they patented, of course, the molecules and so forth. So the first explanation is how do you get competitive advantages? The second one is you have to do over many, many years, very focused investments. Like actually, for example, Google, about 15 years ago, they said, now we are beyond the era of mobile first. That's all done. Everything is mobile. But AI first. 15 years ago, they took about 1/3 of their profits and invested in AI research. 15 years ago. AI, every year AI. Microsoft didn't do that. Microsoft, so that Microsoft had absolutely nothing to. Apple didn't do that. Like they're losers in AI. Google is a winner because for 15 years, they put in maybe around $50 billion just in AI research, right? God, DeepMind, and things like that. So if you're lucky, yeah. But otherwise you have to kind of really have a long-term investment into one thing, and almost if it doesn't work out, you go bankrupt. So that's how you acquire uniqueness, which is hard to copy. The last way, and is actually you can buy a company that actually has it here. You can acquire a company. Not so sure whether this is an answer, but for startups. So startups. So if you have a great idea and you think about how you can compete, sometimes speed can be a BRIM. You're faster. You're a pioneer. The first mover advantage. You know who was the first man on the moon, right? Who was it? Neil Armstrong. And then there was a guy that came 1 minute later. Nobody knows who's the second guy on the moon, but he the poor guy because he just came out 1 minute later. Nobody knows. It's Buzz Aldrin. People know him a little bit because he's hanging out with Trump sometimes, and Neil Armstrong is dead. But yeah, so this is the first mover advantage. Sometimes that couldn't be a competitive advantage, right? So time, not resources. Time can be sometimes competitive advantage. Any other question or pushback?
Last question before we thank our speaker.
Back first, our class one.
What have they thought? So, because of light, we will catch very soon. And also our next speaker, so Dr. Adam Smith, it's going to be here. And then, so let's thank Dr. Shrady again for coming and taking the time to share his knowledge. He's been in Vietnam for 13 years now, also globally, originally from Germany, studied in the US, worked in Brazil and Singapore. And so, you know, this hopefully could be your career too, you know, whether you're working abroad, working in Vietnam, still studying, doing research. I think all these lessons are going to be super valuable as you kind of move forward. Because how many of you are graduating very soon? Yes, right? Yeah, so you might end up working very soon, or you might end up going to doing an MBA like at MIT or overseas or other places. But these are super valuable lessons. So if our monitor can come up, and can someone help with the photo? We'll do it the other way. Yeah, yeah, we do both ways. Okay.
Demerita. Sabihin ko ako, ito yung sa plan na ba niya? Tapos ikaw ito na yun. Okay.